First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today is a big day for us for a number of reasons. Obviously, hosting you is an important thing. And as Chip mentioned, I'm very proud of our team for having completed the audits internally required to do the self-attestation. We are very proud of our focus on secure by design, and we are happy to support CISA's efforts and the broader federal government efforts towards making us all more secure. I have been CEO at SolarWinds now about 3 years, and I'll say it's been a very interesting journey, but I appreciate every federal customer for supporting us through this now and into the future.
I'd say that the level of collaboration is pretty strong. And fortunately, issues like cybersecurity are largely bipartisan issues. And a lot of the people, if you think about over the last 20 years, people in the cyber world, a lot of those people have grown up together. So people have served in government, they've gotten out, they've gone into the private sector. Some people have gone back into government at high and political positions, or they're working on the Hill. So there's a community of people that know each other, and I think, have built up levels of trust with each other. And so we can get into this later, but if you look at the example of the CIRCIA law, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, that was a law that we had spent a lot of time on, and there were a lot of variations on that law, some of which would have probably been much more onerous for companies. And there was a lot of work on the business community side, working with government and working with congressional leaders to shape it in a way that allowed for certain things that were important to us and to our members, or things like the private, confidential submissions, liability protections for people submitting reports, the requirement that government agencies enter into agreements with each other to share information, to try to limit the burden of reporting companies to not have to report 5, 6, 7 different reports. So those are some of that was an area where the collaboration, I think, worked pretty well, and a bill passed that ended up with bipartisan support, business community support, and it's something that now we're waiting to see the regulations drop, which we're expecting, we're told they'll come out any day now. And so, that's where a lot of the rubber meets the road, where, how are we going to work through some of the definitions and other things. But I think largely speaking, if you have good people that, understand and have a common goal to try to improve the cyber landscape, the security landscape, not everybody gets what they want all the time, but you can tend to hammer out some compromises, and hopefully for the good of all.
I don't know if you have any.
I believe there's been a lot of progress made in terms of efforts to collaborate. However, I would also say that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to synthesize, disseminate, leverage, and truly protect both public and private entities. The threat actors are very intense, and we are fighting an asymmetric war, is the way I would describe it, because it is their job and their life to attack. And we have to defend ourselves every single time. And so where there is a lot of activity, I would stop shy of saying there's a lot of progress that results in real material improvements in safety. As I'm sure many of us have more recently read or seen, Microsoft announced some of the breaches that they are experiencing, and they are still experiencing at the very minute. What that shows is that there is no single entity in the world, no matter how big, how good, and how resourceful you are, to protect yourself. And so there requires a more intense and intensified efforts to create these partnerships and protect everybody and disseminate information. I mean, I'll speak from a private sector standpoint, and I have a deep ignorance on how the government works. So I'll let some of the policy making to the government. But as it relates to the private sector, there's a huge role that we have to play. That is the private sector entities. Collectively, we have a tremendous amount of expertise and resources that we can contribute. But unfortunately, what has happened in the spirit of like to each their own has been that a lot of information, and especially security information, is lost, or when it's shared, it's very late to be actionable, and it's very fragmented. And on the side of the government, yes, we speak about the government as if it's a single entity or a monolith. There are multiple agencies, sometimes advertently or inadvertently working at cross purposes. And so what that does is it really creates an opportunity for the attackers, because when do attacks happen? Think about it from a technology standpoint. It happens when there are inconsistencies in your systems, inefficiencies in your systems, and that's what they're exploiting. So I've used this phrase called community vigil, and we need to have a heightened sense of community vigil to improve this.
And I would add, so simply put, all of the above, right? So all instruments of government power need to be used, and people, sometimes scoff at things like diplomatic or law enforcement, but you need to use things like diplomatic authorities. You need to use law enforcement authorities, because even if somebody may not ever be brought to justice in the United States, if you can lock them into a place, or, when they do decide to leave, country X and go somewhere else for vacation, that they can be captured. But then there's all sorts of other authorities that the U.S. government has that can be done either overtly or more quietly to impose consequence and then raise the level of risk for a threat actor. And so I think those are the kinds of things. And then that goes, of course, with, private sector strengthening its capabilities and then working with government. I think briefly we were speaking before, and there are the private sector and frankly government agencies. They know their systems better than others. So the private, banking industry, financial services, or they know which systems are critical to the functioning of, say, the treasury market or the clearing and settlement system. USG needs to know which of those systems are the most critical, so that if they start seeing information about attacks against those, the companies can be made aware and then defend themselves. So it's got to be a virtuous circle.
Let me first tell you what this bill does, okay? Okay, so this bill basically requires divestment by ByteDance of TikTok. ByteDance is the 100% owner of TikTok, and ByteDance is a PRC-based company, which I think is basically controlled by the CCP. The editor-in-chief of ByteDance is the secretary of the CCP cell that is embedded at the very highest levels of the company to control all products. And he's been charged with, quote unquote, making sure all products adhere to correct political direction. And so that's what he does. And for various reasons, we feel very strongly that this poses a grave national security risk. This particular bill really is not about TikTok, it's about ByteDance, and it would require divestment within 6 months of enactment. It went through the House with a 352 to 65 vote margin. Nothing passes out of the House with that kind of a strong bipartisan margin on anything this complicated. But it did, and I'm very pleased to work with Mike Gallagher, my chairman from Wisconsin. He's a Republican. He's a Green Bay Packers fan, but I still managed to swallow hard. And we're working together on this as the chair and ranking member of this committee. It's in the Senate. The White House has urged swift action, and I think Leader Schumer is going to now put it through the process. It falls within two committees' jurisdiction. One is the Intelligence Committee, and the other is the Commerce Committee. So Senator Warner and Senator Cantwell are the two senators who have to kind of see it through or act as Sherpas for it. But we've had some very good conversations, and so now we look at next steps. A little more than a year ago, Congress created a special committee called the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. So this is like a name that is as long as mine. So it's very appropriate that I'm the ranking member, Mike Gallagher is the chair, and former Speaker Kevin McCarthy deserves a lot of credit for working with Hakeem Jeffries to create this committee. And essentially, the committee has been charged with analyzing three areas: the technological risks, the national security risks, and the economic risks associated with the competition with the CCP, and what do you do about them? And so we've issued various reports on these three topics, and now we're pursuing legislation. The ByteDance TikTok bill is really related to that technological risk bucket, although there are others. But we also have legislation, for instance, to end double taxation with regard to investment income from Taiwan. It helps us in two ways. It fosters more investment from Taiwan, and it helps us in making their economy more resilient. We can talk about that more. On the cyber front, going to the cyber issue, this has taken up a lot of our attention because China is the number one source of cyber hacking activity of any country anywhere in the world. In fact, Chris Wray says that their cyber hacking resources basically are more than the rest of the world's combined as far as the FBI is concerned. And they have these crazy statistics about the number of cases that they're opening up every 24 hours just related to the CCP. One area that we focused on, in addition to the cyber hacking that's directed at the private sector to steal intellectual property, to steal personal identifiable information and so forth, is the cyber hacking that's being done to pre-position malware in critical infrastructure, not to collect intelligence, but to potentially damage the infrastructure in the event of conflict. And so it's a very scary thing if you think about it, but they have something called Operation Volt Typhoon. I don't know where they get these names, but Operation Volt Typhoon is meant to pre-position malware in our utilities, in water systems, electric grids, and you name it. But they've put that malware there, and it's very disconcerting, to say the least.
I was simply going to add on the point that whereas previously it was about intellectual property theft and disruption of the private sector, it has now graduated, if I can use that word, to the critical infrastructure. And that is where we need to be extra vigilant, because it's going to impact not just us economically, but the livelihoods and the lives of many of us. So the term cyber warfare has taken on a completely different meaning and significance. And I don't believe the public-private partnerships that we spoke about earlier are fully and comprehensively addressing those types of issues. And we are still very much internally focused as opposed to looking outward from the US on out.
Yeah, and I think I don't have much to add on that, because I think the critical infrastructure piece, that change to critical infrastructure attacks, are very concerning. I'll just mention that, some of the things that we were doing at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce over the years, like for instance, with Huawei in rural telecommunications networks. So we worked with CISA, with the National Counterintelligence and Security Center within DNI, with the FCC, and we hosted a series of events around the country to try to bring awareness to some of the rural telecommunications providers on what potential threats were. And when you start looking at where these networks were, or where the equipment was, and it's co-located or very close to sensitive military facilities, people start to wake up a little bit. I think the other area where we worked very closely with Senators Warner and Rubio, starting in 2018, was with these ideas of these roadshows where we would bring in companies, CEOs, in conjunction with Senator Warner and Senator Rubio and others, to do one-day classified read-ins where companies would be briefed on some of the threats from foreign nation-state actors. And it's no surprise that the vast majority of some of that activity was coming from the Chinese Communist Party. So it's something that we're very attuned to and are very interested in, playing a role in helping bridge the gap between government and the private sector. And we've got a lot of time for you and your committee, Representative Krishnamurthy. We work closely with your staff and have found them really smart and very responsive.
Thank you. Well, I proved that message. Unfortunately, in China, they have something called the 1993 company law. And the 1993 company law requires that the CCP be embedded in the leadership of every company. Now, for 20 or 30 years, I think that they paid lip service to this. They, in name, they had like a party cell that would be in these companies. But under Xi Jinping, those party cells have basically, in my opinion, taken the reins of the leadership. They've become like co-operators of some of these companies. They don't just check the box for whether there's a CCP cell. They make sure that the company is adhering to not just ideological purity, but also the goals of the CCP. So, just as an example, if the party and the government said, we want access to X data of Y company, the company would have to adhere to that request. And that's why we're so concerned about ByteDance. But for that matter, we're concerned about numerous PRC-based companies that essentially have now become suspect because of their fusion with the government. Not just the government, but also the military. So now you have the CCP that's embedded in the company, commanding the company to do X, Y, and Z. And then they say, and oh, by the way, we want you to share your tech with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So now you have the PLA and the company, the supposed private company, and the government all working together and helping each other out and also subsidizing each other. And so it not only puts our companies on an unlevel playing field competitively, but now we're talking about national security risks. So when you combine it all, it becomes a really toxic brew. I think the Biden administration has taken a very forward-leaning approach with regard to this issue. We see that with regard to their outbound investment controls. We see that with regard to their tech export controls, semiconductor controls. I think it's going to be a dance because there are areas where we do have relationships with Chinese companies that are fruitful for us, but parsing it all out is going to be complicated. And that's like the one word that I've learned to use over and over again in my work on the CCP Select Committee. This is complicated. I feel like that's what I say to my teenager and my 3 kids. This is complicated. So, but that's kind of the world that we're living in when we're dealing with Chinese companies right now.
Got in the committee.
Right, exactly.
I would say I was complicated is a word that came to mind for me as well, in the sense that there is a lot of legitimate business that goes on between the United States, American companies, and other countries, and China. There is a massive trade relationship between the United States and China. And so, going through this, I think I think people have generally been, or many people have been, trying to be careful in ensuring that when we're talking about this, we're talking about things where it's Chinese Communist Party controlled, where companies are being forced to, give over information, turn over information. And I think, for us, where the challenge sometimes is when we're working with Congress, there may be some very well-intentioned provisions in a defense bill that like I said, well-intentioned, but sometimes they're extremely broad. So the application can be very hard for defense contractors to be able to certify that they're, complying with particular law. So where we're trying to, walk that line is how do we identify the areas, the systems, the technologies that are critical to national security, ensure that those are being protected. And then if there's things that are a little more, off the shelf, non-sensitive, that those may be outside the scope of certain restrictions. And so, again, that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of, a lot of effort and really relying on trust that you build with others. But yeah, it's not an easy solution.
from a private sector standpoint, our focus continues to be on principles such as secure by design that I described, and some of the work that we're doing with the public sector, including the self-attestation that Chip spoke about. These are ways of harmonizing our threat defenses across the private sector. That is one, call it internal obligation that we all have to take. But we also have an external obligation, and that is to be much more transparent with threat information and security information than we have been all these years. We have taken a lot of pride as SolarWinds to be very transparent with everything that has gone on with us. But I wouldn't say that that is necessarily the case or is consistent across the industry. And the more consistent that we can become, the faster we can address and anticipate these threat issues. So that's on us. On agencies such as CISA, my constant feedback and encouragement has been take inputs from everyone, synthesize and disseminate. And I think there's a lot of work that can still be done, both by the private sector as well as agencies like CISA, to, again, lift everyone's security postures up. There's a lot of inconsistency still, and that creates opportunity for threat attacks.
So Dr. makes a great point, and I referenced the CIRCIA rules. CISA and the government wants lots of information from critical infrastructure entities, right? So our message to them is that's great. Once you get it, you have to then use it and then distribute insights that you gain from that in order to potentially warn others within an industry or within other industries, and it's got to be done quickly. And so I think that's an area where that sort of muscle memory, that relation has to build. Without that, then this opportunity to ingest lots of data and then just hold it. It really, it's a missed opportunity, I think, for all. So, and then on the company side, the people in the audience are probably much better versed than I am to give any of that kind of advice. But it's doing things like continuing to harden your systems, to do your backups, to test and train employees, but then also build relationships with your local CISA office or your FBI field office, because you want to have a relationship with a person before something bad happens. It's much easier to solve a problem when you have a relationship, when the person on the other line knows who you are. So, but it's just got to move quickly. Everything is moving fast. The DHS and the Office of the National Cyber Director have programs to ensure harmonization. So on the DHS side, it's in implementation of CIRCIA. It gets even down to things like, what does the form look like? What would a report look like? So that you could standardize that as much as possible. I think that would be helpful. But again, like, we haven't seen this, and then where you have a complete outlier, frankly, is the SEC's cyber incident disclosure rule, which in our view is out of step with where the rest of the government and the private sector was going in terms of collaboration and regulatory harmonization. So it's an independent agency, so it's much more difficult to work with in some ways. It's not beholden to the administration in ways that federal agencies are. But really, I think I sense there's a sincerity on it, but we've got a lot of work, as Sudhakar said, a lot of work's got to get done, and we'll see once the regulations drop how we can get those things implemented.
Totally.
Our journey is a work in progress. So is the journey of all the regulators and the policies that they're working on. As much as we have made progress, I still believe that there's more consolidation and simplification needed because it's very difficult to decipher what's going on right now. And I think an authority like, or an agency like CISA is ideally placed to help everyone do it. Now the question is, are they empowered enough? Are they resourced enough? And a while ago, I proposed that instead of every private company doing its own thing, what if companies above a certain size commit a full-time equivalent to CISA They all work under the guidance of CISA, and we have so much more expertise than what one agency can have. But in return, what you do is the learnings from them, to Chris's earlier point, are disseminated, distilled, and distributed to people who can protect themselves better. I think that would be a great public-private partnership. I think we still have work to do to get to stages like that.
So broadly speaking, I'll be blunt, we think that those rules were a solution in search of a problem, because you've got the federal securities laws, the 33 Act and the 34 Act, that require companies to disclose material changes to their operations or finances. So you have that. The SEC issued good guidance in 2018 and 2012 on how companies should be thinking about cyber reporting within their companies and disclosure. And then they have an enforcement division. So if companies are not disclosing what they need to, they have capabilities. So I think, we were scratching our heads a little bit on this one. Companies are doing the best they can, but if you look at some of the disclosures that have come out, they've been fairly benign. So and a couple of that sort of align is like, we're disclosing that something happened. We don't believe it to be material, but we don't know. And so preemptive disclosure, it's if you put yourself in an individual investor's shoes, it's pretty hard to get a sense of if something's important or not by that. So we'll see once we get through one quarter of reporting how that's unfolding. The SEC did say that it was going to be very light on enforcement for the first year, which is good. It gives companies opportunities to work through issues. But again, I think you're going to see a lot of uncertainty. And then, frankly, we've also seen some early indications that if someone who may be concerned that they have had an incident may be reluctant to share information with customers or others for fear of then providing material non-public information in violation of the securities law. So they get stuck inside a box. And when speed, again, is very important. If a company realizes, if it's a cloud service provider or whatever, is having an incident, they need to get that information quickly to their customers so that people can react. But if they're worried that they're going to be pushing out inside information, you can see some really unforeseeable but unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I think that those are valid concerns. But I think that what I'm hearing from my constituents and what I'm hearing from a lot of people at this point is that the cyber hacking problem is becoming such an avalanche of attacks. I talked to you about nation state actors like the CCP that's at the source of this, that I'm concerned that unless private industry, obviously working with the government, takes this much, much, much more seriously, there's going to be, you talk about the SEC coming down with these rules, there's going to be something much greater that comes down the pike, something like Sarbanes-Oxley, something that really hits industry like a ton of bricks at some point, because there's going to be such a crisis that envelops industry that that public will not tolerate what they're seeing right now. The amount of ransomware attacks, just as an example, has become so commonplace that in Chicago, we're now routinely seeing hospitals targeted. Lurie Children's Hospital, which is probably the biggest children's hospital in the Midwest, attracts thousands of people from all over the Midwest for critical procedures for little children, was recently the subject of a ransomware attack. The hospital went down for like 3 days. And this is obviously a not-for-profit that we're talking about, not necessarily a company, but people were infuriated about it, didn't know what was going on. Children weren't having their procedures done. Critically ill patients were going without care. And then another hospital got attacked after that. Another healthcare exchange got attacked after that. What is it called? Digital?
Change
Health.
Healthcare.
Change Healthcare got attacked after that. And it goes on and on and on. And now I talked to you about the critical infrastructure piece. That is the subject of a whole new range of attacks. Mainly why? Because a lot of private companies and local governments have not upgraded their software or their hardware for decades. And it has become a perfect target for the CCP or cyber gangs or the North Koreans or the Iranians to attack. So CISA obviously is trying their best to work with private industry to encourage them to do these software updates and hardware updates and so forth, but it's not going at the pace that's necessary. So I would just say that if this continues, this pattern continues, that there's going to be a lot of litigation, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing, and ultimately probably a lot of regulation that's going to come down. So I think we should affirmatively do whatever we can right now to kind of nip the problem in the bud to the extent possible and kind of work proactively with each other before it becomes a crisis.
I agree with everything that was said, but I'll also say the following as a practitioner. That doesn't mean that you can just like throw up your arms and not do anything about it. You have to do everything that everyone is proposing and more. But what I'll also say is that no matter how sophisticated you are, the reason why I gave the Microsoft example is one of the largest security software companies in the world. It is the largest company in the world by market cap, has got some of the most brilliant minds in the world, and is probably most up to date. See what's happening to it right now, as they admitted. So it is not a matter of enforcing to say you need to be up to standard. No, at no other time in our history is more money being spent on security software by a lot of companies. And oh, by the way, a number of companies that are getting attacked and hacked are security software companies themselves. So there's a lot more that needs to be done here in terms of how we create this community vigil to support, as opposed to the stick is not the answer for this. It is more about collaboration. It's more about consistency of that collaboration. It's about consistency of helping people and entities like the healthcare entities that Raja was mentioning live up to a certain standard without having to break the bank, so to speak. And so it needs to become much more like a utility. Security information should be like utility. Everyone should have access to how to protect themselves, and it shouldn't be the job of just a few people who have been able to protect themselves better than others. So that's my point of view as a practitioner.